Unit 4 deals with the judicial branch in the state of Texas. And so in the United States, there are two different court systems that operate. Each state has their own individual court system, and then we have the federal court system. And so we're going to be looking at the Texas state court system today, the structure of it, and the different courts that are involved in the state level. So they are going to be established by a couple of different things, by the Texas Constitution or by the legislature, by statute. And most states provide for three levels of courts. They usually provide for trial courts, appellate courts, and Supreme Courts. But just like most other things in Texas, the Texas court system is much bigger and much more complex. And the structure of courts in Texas is more complicated. And I will at some point upload a flow chart that outlines the court structure of the state of Texas. And so Texas has several levels of trial courts, several levels of appellate courts, and we actually have not only one Supreme Court, but two Supreme Courts. And so this lecture is going to go through the structure of this court system, and we're going to try to get a pretty good background information as to what our state court system looks like. So, as I said, there are several levels of trial and appellate courts. And so if we start looking at trial courts first, trial courts are local courts that hear cases. Typically in a trial court, juries are going to determine the outcome of the cases that are heard in this court. So these are going to be those regular kinds of courts that we think about when we think about a trial. And in Texas, there are several different levels of trial courts. You have justices of the peace, municipal courts, county courts, district courts, special purpose courts, which include probate courts, juvenile courts, and domestic relations courts. And then we have 14 intermediate appellate courts, and as I said earlier, two Supreme Courts. One for civil cases, which is called the Texas Supreme Court, and one for criminal cases, which is called the Court of Criminal Appeals. So we're going to look at each of these a little bit more in depth. So as I said, trial courts are defined as local courts that hear cases. Juries determine the outcome of cases heard in these courts typically. The characteristics of trial courts are that they are localized. Their jurisdiction is very limited geographically, and so there's going to be a specific area geographically that these courts are going to deal with. In these courts, it's going to be one judge. There is citizen participation in trial court activity, meaning that the citizens are going to participate in different ways, like serving on juries, they serve as witnesses, they testify during the trial, and then another characteristic is that they're primarily concerned with establishing the facts of the case. And so we're going to see that whenever we leave a trial court and we head to the appellate court system, the appellate court does not retry a case. The appellate court simply ensures that the lower court did things properly and there was no things out of line, and that the person got a fair and free trial. And so the trial court is going to be the one that establishes the facts of the case. They also will announce their decisions immediately after the case, which is not always the case in the appellate court and the Supreme Court system. They announce their decisions a little bit later. So the types of trial courts. We have some minor courts, and the minor courts are going to be the justices of the peace, and these are created by the Texas Constitution. A JP typically are going to be elected, and they do not have to be an attorney. They will go through specialized training in the law, but they're not required to be attorneys. And they are actually what are known as trial de novos, meaning that they do not keep a written record of their proceedings. And so when the case is appealed, it actually does begin a new case in the appellate courts. And so we'll see this sort of play out in just a moment when we talk about the county courts and things like that. But these minor courts are just that. They're very minor. In some cases, the JP can provide for a coroner function for a county, like in very small communities where there is no coroner, they can perform this function. And they can also issue a search and arrest warrants. And they do try minor cases, things that are against city ordinances, traffic ticket violations. All of those are going to be tried by the JP courts. And so these are going to be very, very minor. They also serve as small claims court in Texas. And so depending on the dollar amount that is involved, it can JPs can try these small claims. And as I said, JPs are elected. We also have, as minor courts, municipal courts. And municipal courts were created by the Texas legislature. They also try minor cases like infractions against city ordinances and traffic violations and things like that. But they also serve as the magistrate function. They inform people of charges. They inform people of their rights. They set bail. They issue search warrants. And so they're sort of the preliminary hearing for individuals who are charged with a more serious crime. And municipal courts are going to be appointed by city councils, or they're elected depending on the particular municipal area that the court deals with. One interesting thing is that a difference between the JP and the municipal courts is that JPs can actually perform marriages. And even though JPs and municipal courts are sort of on that same minor level, JPs can perform marriages, whereas municipal court judges cannot. So just some different functions of these minor court systems. Then you get to the county courts. And county courts are going to be created by the Texas Constitution. There is one in each county, and so we have 254 counties in the state of Texas. Each county is going to have a county court. County courts at law, so there's also these constitutional county courts that are created, but then there's county courts at law that have been created in large urban counties by the Texas legislature. And these are going to sort of supersede that constitutional court law. In these counties that have these county courts at law, the constitutional court actually ceases to function as a court, and the county judge becomes almost an exclusively administrative officer or county executive, but retains the title of judge with some limited judicial functions. And so the state constitution, when we deal with these constitutional county courts, is going to create those, is going to determine their jurisdiction. But these cases are, those county courts are going to be large urban counties, created for large urban counties that have a larger caseload. And these courts are going to hear more intermediate criminal and civil cases. So things that are a little bit more serious than in those minor courts. They're typically misdemeanors, and typically, on average, more than 1 million cases are pled in Texas in the county courts each year. And the most common type of case are DWI cases, worthless checks, violation of drug laws, and traffic appeals cases from city and justice courts. And so they're going to deal with more of an intermediate nature of cases. They also serve as the Court of Appeals for the JP and the municipal courts. And so typically, and I've said this a moment ago, typically appellate courts do not retry cases. They just simply look at the facts of the case and ensure that the case followed all the laws and everybody got a fair trial. But because JP and municipal courts don't keep a record, they are de novo courts, and there's nothing for a county court to actually look at and examine. Then when you appeal to a county court, if you get a hearing at a JP court or a municipal court and you don't like it, and you appeal to a county court, then you actually get an entirely new trial. And so it's actually very common practice in the state of Texas to appeal a traffic ticket at the county court, because typically if you do this, you typically have it tried at the JP or the municipal level. But if you take this to the county court, these are very minor things. They're having to deal with more intermediate cases, misdemeanors and DWIs and bad checks and things like that. And so due to their heavy caseload, the fact that they try over 1 million cases in county courts each year, typically what will happen is that your ticket, if you have the ability to hire a lawyer and go through this process, the ticket will get buried under the court caseload, and there's a good chance that the ticket will be forgotten in the county court caseload. And so a lot of people can sometimes get out of a ticket in this way, but typically that's not I'm not trying to give you any legal advice, and I wouldn't necessarily suggest that you do that, because you will have to hire a lawyer and go through that process and have the means in order to do that. But typically traffic violations are so small that you just sort of plead them out, pay the fine, and move on. So trial courts, constitutional county courts, and county courts at law, these will be the appellate courts for JP and the municipal courts. So the different types of trial courts, we have district courts. We're keeping dealing with the different types of courts that are trial courts. And Texas has 465 district courts that are created by that Texas legislature. Oftentimes the county courts and the district courts can overlap, and so sometimes you can decide where you want those to be tried. You want them to be tried at the district court, you want them to be tried at the county court level. But they do try cases like murder, armed robbery, theft, so they're going to be those more serious crimes that are committed at the state level. Typically, large urban counties will have several district courts in their jurisdiction, in their area. But in smaller rural areas, district courts may serve several different counties. And like I said, they often do overlap with those county courts. And so you can decide where to hold your case in that situation. So now we turn our attention to the appellate court system in Texas, and there are different types of appellate courts. There are 14 courts of appeal, which have 80 judges, and these are elected by districts in the state. They hear all civil appeals cases, so anytime that there is an appeal to a case that was heard at a lower court, and it deals with civil issues rather than criminal issues, then these are going to be heard at this courts of appeals. They hear all criminal appeals as well, except those involving the death penalty. And if a criminal appeal involves the death penalty, it automatically gets kicked up to that Supreme Court level that we'll talk about in just a moment. And so, as I said, Texas has 14 courts of appeals with 80 judges elected by districts in the state. And interestingly enough, only California has more judges and courts at this level. So Texas has a pretty large appellate court system. And um, yeah, so it's going to hear these criminal and civil cases. And as I said, if it is a case that deals with the death penalty, it automatically get kicked out to the Supreme Court. So all states have a Supreme Court, or what is known as a court of last resort. Okay, but I believe there's only 2 states in the United States that have 2 Supreme Courts, and Texas is one of them. Oklahoma is the other, and Oklahoma copied that from Texas. So Texas has 2 Supreme Court. In civil matters, and you know the difference between a civil matter and a criminal matter. If you're breaking a law and being charged for that, then it's a criminal matter. If it's a civil matter and it's between individuals, then it's a civil matter. But all civil matters are dealt with by the Texas Supreme Court. All criminal matters are going to be dealt with by the Court of Criminal Appeals. But they're both Supreme Courts in Texas. They're the courts of last resort, and oftentimes they are going to provide the very last say about a case. And so that's why they are known as a court of last resort. Each one is going to consist of 9 justices that are elected statewide. We elect our judges in Texas, which is not something that is done at the federal level. Remember, at the federal level, if you have taken federal government, they are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But in Texas, we elect them, and so we have 9 justices at the Supreme Court level, and we have 9 justices at the Court of Criminal Appeals, and they are elected for 6-year overlapping terms. And so we're going to be looking a little bit more at the method for determining our courts as we move forward. But we're going to stop here, and this kind of gives you a basic idea of the structure of the court system in Texas. And as I said, I'm going to upload a flowchart to kind of help hammer this out a little bit more. So stay tuned for the next lecture, and I will see you then.